Hello, everyone. Welcome to this celebration of Rosalind Franklin. And I would specifically want to welcome our guest contributors today. Jenifer Glyn, Rosalind's younger sister, and a much treasured Newnhamite herself, history 1948. Rosalind's nieces, Veronica and Shirley Franklin, who will read letters between Rosalind and Rosalind's mother during Rosalind's time here at Newnham. Please come in. So we're going to start off with a personal talk by Jenifer, which will be followed by readings by Veronica and Shirley. There will be time for questions, and towards the end, I will contribute with 2 films. One film from archived material with collaborators to Rosalind, and a short trailer from a film which will be released soon. So, welcome, Jenifer.
Thank you. This plaque commemorates Rosalind's achievements, but on this anniversary day, I want to talk about the start of that achievement, Rosalind's time at Newnham. Rosalind went to Newnham in the autumn of 1938, 84 years ago, so Newnham was then less than half as old as it is now. Rosalind was also young. She was only just 18. She came from St. Paul's, a girls' school in London, from a Jewish family concerned with the problems facing refugees and Jews in Germany. She arrived anxious to study, serious-minded, puzzled by the variety of views among her contemporaries. She wrote very full weekly letters home, as she was to do all her life. The wonderful thing is that my mother kept those letters. Reading them, I can imagine Rosalind speaking, sometimes simply describing her life, sometimes deliberately provoking argument as if she was at home. She always enjoyed argument. The 5 letters in the Newnham archive, which you're about to hear, tell of the approach of war and of the great Newnham landmark, the election of Dorothy Garrett as the first woman professor. And also at that time, Rosalind wrote enthusiastically about our family's surprising plan of a holiday in Norway before we were overtaken by war, a plan only just achieved. Rosalind loved that holiday. She loved travel, she loved mountains, and she always enjoyed maps and planning holidays. I have a drawer full of her maps. Can I have Rosalind in Norway? This was the image of Rosalind, happy in the Norwegian mountains, that my mother chose as a frontispiece to her memorial book on Rosalind. This was not Rosalind's first experience of European travel. She'd been to France, first on a rather formal visit to Mentone with our grandparents, and then when she left school for 6 weeks on her own to a family just outside Paris, studying French and French culture, an early form of gap year. It left Rosalind with a permanent love of France, which was of great influence all her life. War started before the 1939 Michaelmas term, and my father, who had been delighted and proud when Rosalind won a place at Newnham, thought that she should instead do war work, as his sisters had done in 1914. David, our oldest brother, left Oxford and joined the army. But Rosalind, equally anxious to help the war effort, was convinced, rightly, that she would be more use as a scientist than in the Land Army or any other volunteer organization. Though she was anxious to work for various refugee groups in the vacations. Successful in her fight to stay, she wrote home triumphantly that 90% of Newnham has returned, though many from the Cavendish hadn't, and in many ways, Cambridge had changed. Rosalind now wrote of gas masks, blackout, fire drill, of evacuated children, students from London colleges, planes and RAF stations all round. And she described, as you will hear, the one drama for Newnham's emergency services when they were called out to rescue the Newnham 8 who had gone through the floodgates. Concern about the war was, of course, constant, but she wrote also about the trivial side of Newnham's wartime life, the shortage of toast, the achievement, the inconvenience of all eating in the same hall. But she was never afraid to protest to Newnham authorities of more important things she thought wrong or unnecessary. Fed up with the endless interruptions, Rosalind complained, successfully, of how impossible it was to work when there was so much evening time wasted going to the cold trenches in the college garden. As well as pouring out political thoughts and wartime worries, Rosalind wrote of more normal concerns, improvements for her room, societies to join, problems with so much work, pleasures of skating. Can we have a skating picture? This is skating actually on the frozen Cam. She skated actually on the mill pond and on frozen Grantchester Meadows, but before climate change, there was a lot more ice those days. She also went cycle rides and had plans for holidays. From her second year, of course, this necessarily meant holidays in Britain, mostly the most mountainous and wild parts. Social life seems mostly to have been limited to coffee parties in college. Surprisingly, she didn't make new close friends among her contemporaries. None joined her holidays, for example, but remained loyal to her school friends and to various relations. The one new friend, and she became an important one in Rosalind's postgraduate life and her whole future career, was Adrienne Vey. Can I have a picture of her? Oh, there she is, Adrienne on the left, looking at some apparatus, I don't know what. Adrienne was a French refugee scientist adopted by Newnham. She was a widow, far older than Rosalind, but she was lively, French, always, of course, a plus for Rosalind, and what's more, had worked with Marie Curie. During Rosalind's undergraduate years, we can see her constant interest in her work and her constant anxiety to do well. Her supervisors found her ever ready to discuss and defend her views, as she was all her life. My mother wrote, even as a tiny child, she could never accept a belief or statement for which no reason or proof could be produced. A good attitude for a scientist, and in fact, though my mother didn't know it, the motto of the Royal Society. After graduation, Rosalind's first year of research was disappointing, for she didn't believe the problem she was given to be sound or worth doing, and her supervisor would not tolerate disagreement or argument. To do any work that's worthwhile, she once wrote, one needs to be passionately interested in one's subject. She was to find both passionate interest and notable success in her later work, first in her war research into the structure of coals, and later, famously, into the structure of DNA and of viruses. And this is Quentin Blake's take of her work on DNA. Right. Up to you.
Dear Mother and Father, thank you for your letter. You must have had a good day at Portsmouth yesterday. It is even better today, and everyone is working, sprawling about the garden. I can't work outside. I find I get cramp in my arm one way up and a stiff tummy the other way up, and it's too dark in the shade and too bright in the sun and always very insecty. So I am sprawling on my bed instead. The difficulty is I light my fire early this morning because it was cold, and now I've got to keep it in because it will be cold again tonight. The chief news in Newnham is that the first female professor ever to be elected in Oxford or Cambridge has been elected from Newnham in archaeology. It is not yet known whether she is to be a member of the university. Yesterday afternoon we went flower hunting. We got bluebells and masses of huge cowslips. We also saw the true oxlip. A letter in the Times the day before said, "Stand bluebells in boiling water to stop them drooping." I tried. It seemed successful with the top half, but the part that has been in the boiling water goes all flabby and shrivels where it meets the other part, so that it makes them very short. I played an extremely hard game of tennis this morning. I'm having my 3rd punting lesson tomorrow. One is supposed to be proficient after 3 or 4. Last time somebody fell in, got back at 8:30, had breakfast and a hot bath, and arrived early for a 9 o'clock lecture. Do you think there is anything in Japan's fear of a Russian-German rapprochement? It seems a long time since Hitler last cursed at Russia. Love from Rosalind. P.S. Have you thought about the summer holidays yet? If not, please think.
Newnham, July the 19th, 1939. Dear Mother and Father, I should certainly welcome a visit on Saturday. I may have to finish off Friday's lab work sometime in the morning, but if I did, it would only be cooling and weighing and wouldn't take long. I think any time after 10:30 or 10:45 should be quite safe. I hope it will be fine enough to go on the river. Would you like tea here? If so, how many family will you be bringing? Last night, the government propaganda machine came round. It established itself over a quarter of a mile away, and I heard every word from my room. Thinking it was a wireless in one of the other houses, the other end of the field, 3 of us went to ask them to turn it down. We found this thing miles beyond and let off our feelings at the policeman in charge. The programme lasted an hour, starting with a Mickey Mouse to attract a crowd. It almost made me regret that I'm doing a little bit of quote-unquote national service. Geologists all over the country are being asked to survey gravel pits with regard to sandbags, etc. Every road has to be searched and full details of every pit collated. Cambridge geologists are doing Cambridgeshire, and I am cycling round the nearest area with a friend who does geology. So far, we have been found once and found two. We have been once and found two, which we could not investigate because it was Sunday. Sometime before you go, I like exact times of everything I have to catch on the way to Fearland, so you might as well bring the necessary information when you come. Don't forget to ask your friend at Selwyn to meet you in Newnham. Love from Rosalind.
Dear Mother and Father, thank you for the gas mask and letter. I have written to Mrs. Rose's Polish girl. 90% of Newnham has returned, and I do not know of any science person in Newnham or Girton who has not. Practically the whole of the Cavendish have disappeared, and we had our first lecture this morning from Colin's friend, Professor Ferguson, who I gather is a great improvement on the usual lecturer on heat. Next term's lecturer has gone too, and so have the people who take our labs. We are having a female from Bedford instead. The mineralogy department seems to be quite intact, and chemistry has only a few missing. The college is most effectively blacked out. They say it took 5 weeks hard work to achieve. At present, there are black shades on the brighter lights because they have been unable to obtain weaker bulbs. One unfortunate result of the blackout is that chemistry labs are now 11 to 3 instead of 11 to 1 and 2 to 5. Not a very satisfactory arrangement. Inside the college, we have 9 architecture students from London and 11 of Bedford staff. Everything goes on as usual, except that there is no toast for breakfast and that we no longer have to draw our own curtains when it gets dark. We do not, so far, have to carry gas masks. Only geographers do. But apparently, we do have to spend hours in the trenches every time there is a warning. I am supposed to be responsible for waking 10 people along this corridor, and I'm provided with a beautiful new whistle for the purpose. As our siren is on Selwyn Tower, I don't think I shall have a very hard task. I don't know whether anyone will wake me. Cambridge is very congested at present. There are evacuated children, strange colleges, and RAF all around. Bedford people share bedrooms and are scattered all over the town, with only a house in Sidgwick Avenue as headquarters. There are 450 of them here. Post is just going, love from Rosalind.
Newnham, January the 28th, 1940. Dear Mother and Father, many thanks for letters and handkerchiefs. With regard to my writing, I discovered its first fault this afternoon. I have been writing answers to numerous questions on electrostatics, and I couldn't discover how to make charge, C-H-A-R-G-E, look different from change, C-H-A-N-G-E, thus confusing the issue considerably. For all other purposes, I find it quite adequate and have even trained myself, after much effort, to write P, R, and N distinguishably in mathematics, a difficulty which has worried me ever since I first learned algebra. Though I confess I got a little confused yesterday when I was dealing with one problem. I believe skating is still going, though I haven't been for some days. It hasn't the same attraction in dull weather as in the glorious weather we have had for the first 8 or 9 days. The ice was very thick, and it will take some time to go, though I think if I go again, I shall have flooded fields rather than deep ponds. It's freezing again tonight. I can't shut my window because I did not wipe off this morning's snow, and now it's stuck firmly. We have got quite a lot of snow, I suppose 6 to 8 inches, and they have produced a snowplough for the garden paths. I'm feeling terribly virtuous. It's quite a good one, yes. I'm feeling terribly virtuous at the moment, as I have just returned from the library after working there 10 till 1 and 1:20 till 5:15. I don't often do things like that. For the first time, I'm being able to keep up with my work this time, so far. It's so much nicer to be working up to date instead of always trying to do what should have been done weeks ago. When will you be visiting me this term? I would rather not either of the weekends between February the 14th and February the 28th, as I've got an extra chemistry course on then and shall be very busy. Either next Sunday or the one after will be all right. Love from Rosalind.
Newnham, Tuesday. Dear Mother and Father, many thanks for letters and telephone message. I hope Father is all right now and you will be able to come this Sunday. What sort of time will you come? Cambridge continues to be quiet except for a few more meals disturbed by the buzzer. The 4-engine bombers which we have here are quite a different type from the ones we have at Radlett, from which you will doubtless be able to calculate that we have at least 2 sorts of 4-engine bombers. The first of Newnham's ARP services was called to action last weekend when the Newnham 8 went through the floodgates and the Red X detachment were called out. It was an amazing affair. The river was in flood and they got into trouble in turning by the lock. The boat cracked up and the 8 went under the floodgate in the broken boat among breaking oars and all escaped with no more than bad bruises. I do not think that Churchill was up to his usual form on Sunday. The first part was terribly dull, and it was quite unnecessarily long, and I can't imagine why he tries to concentrate all our hate on Mussolini. Still, as you're coming here on Sunday, any further provocative criticism will probably not get answered. Love from Rosalind.
So I want to share with you a short film, which is a trailer for a film to come. The year 2020 marked the centenary of Rosalind Franklin's birth. Here I hope to give you a flavor of a documentary that will be released soon. We will discover her personality.
Yes, she had a very logical mind.
But she definitely had a sense of humour, because there is something else in my memory that...
You're using your hands, you're using your mind all the time. And she was absolutely first class.
And also understand her through her friendships. Even friendships we might see as unlikely.
Well, she stayed with the Cricks at times of her convalescence.
And my father told me he was her best friend, or he said she was his best friend.
She was Ross with the family, otherwise Rosalind, with one notable exception, Don Casper.
He could call her Ros, and nobody objected to that, and she didn't object to that.
We'll follow her path to Newnham College, Cambridge for her undergraduate degree and obtaining a PhD, to her frugal but happy existence in post-war Paris, where she learned crystallography, to miserable years at King's College, London, where she generated the data allowing Jim Watson and Francis Crick at the Cavendish in Cambridge to propose the correct structure of DNA, and finally at Birkbeck College, where Rosalind ran a very successful virus structure lab. Sadly, she died from cancer at the height of her career, not having turned 38, but her legacy lives on.
So I want to talk a little bit about Rosalind and DNA. And first of all, I want to start off with where was science in the 1950s. So the chemistry of the bases, so the chemistry of the nucleotides had been known for quite some time. And so these are the actual building blocks in the DNA double helix. But whether or not DNA had something to do with hereditary material, this is a landmark paper was less clear. So this is a landmark paper from 1944 by Oswald Avery. And in this paper, they showed that a transforming substance can be degraded by enzymes that degrade DNA, but not protein. So it really showed that they could transfer phenotypes between two bacterial strains, which indicated that the DNA was in fact the material that was the hereditary material. So that was the first sort of landmark paper on this. Now, Avery did not receive a Nobel Prize for this. It was later confirmed in 1952 that DNA is in fact the genetic material. And these were studies done in phages, so bacteriophages, in other words, viruses that infect bacteria. And the virus has a protein structure, which is the shell, and a genetic material, in this case, a DNA material. And they labeled with radioactive isotopes, either the protein or the DNA, and they could show that it's the label, the isotope label of the DNA, which is transferred into the bacteriophage at the point of infection. But Maurice Wilkins writes in his autobiography that most scientists believe that DNA was something to do with genes, perhaps in a supporting role, accompanying protein that carried the genetic information. And the reason for that was that since the chemistry was known, the bases, there are 4 different bases, A, T, C, G, but there are more than 20 amino acids. So the complication to create this genetic material was believed to be that DNA was simply just a too simple molecule for that. And this is a quote from another LMB alumnus, Mark Bretcher, who was a research student with Sidney Brenner, and he came to the newly formed LMB in 1961, and he said, I became surprised at the lack of knowledge or interest in the general public and amongst biochemists about DNA. It just didn't figure in their view of biochemistry or nature. So actually, at this point in time, DNA was not particularly exciting. It wasn't even abbreviated DNA until the Watson and Crick paper. So Rosalind, happily coming back, or not happily coming back, but happily in Paris, came back on a 3-year research fellowship to join the group in King's College in the physics department. So there was a biophysics research unit that she joined with her own money. And she was now, she had done a PhD, she'd done a postdoc, and she had an independent fellowship. So she was a distinguished scientist already, and she had already a solid publication record that would encompass 15 papers on coals and carbons, and she will later publish 5 papers on DNA and at least 16 on her virus work. But at the point when she came to King's, she had her own funding, and she was given DNA to work on a DNA preparation and to work on DNA. And this is where the whole controversy started. So already at King's was Maurice Wilkins, and Raymond Gosselin. And when Rosalind started, Maurice Wilkins misunderstood and thought that she would be assisting him. Up in Cambridge was Jim and Francis Crick, so Jim Watson and Francis Crick, who were also very keen on solving the structure of DNA. And particularly Jim Watson was very much focused on the biology and the DNA as a genetic material. Linus Pauling in the US at Caltech, a protein chemist, but he was also in the race to try and solve DNA. Max Perutz was this PhD supervisor for Francis Crick, and Aaron Klug was a later co-worker of Rosalind. So the work had begun in King's, and Maurice Wilkins had already worked on DNA, but he wasn't actually the first to do structural analysis on DNA. It was this lady, Florence Bell. And Florence Bell was a Girton graduate. She studied natural sciences at Girton. And she did some work here at the Cavendish with J.D. Bernal to learn crystallography. And she produced this photographic image of the scattered X-ray diffraction of DNA in 1938 already. And this is just showing the attitude at the time. So this is a Yorkshire Evening News from 1939. She was chosen to represent the lab at this meeting up in Leeds. And this was the headline, "Woman Scientist Explains." So anyway, so when Rosalind came, she completely transformed the field. So it came from this into this. And the reason for that was she was a physical chemist, and she was very good with her hands and a really good experimentalist. So she had to build some of this apparatus to keep the moisture, to vary the moisture in the sample. And she also had very good DNA. So the preparation of the DNA was very good. Then we have the two very eager scientists in Cavendish. So Rosalind gave a talk in late 1951 that Watson attended, and she explained some of the characters of DNA, that there could be 2-3 chains, the space group, which has to do with the direction of the, I'm not a crystallographer, but the direction of the chains, that the bases would be on the inside and the phosphate facing the outside, the helical repeat. So if you go one full length of the helix, you would have 10 bases in that repeat, so the stacking, etc. And one of the most important things that Rosalind found was the two forms, which are naturally occurring forms. One is less hydrated and the other one is more hydrated. So for example, the bacteria or certain viruses have more of the A form than the B form. So that was the thing. She separated out these two forms, and because of her very, very good analysis, she found all these parameters. So then the chaps in Cambridge started building models around this. So Watson hadn't exactly understood what Rosalind was talking about. He came here actually in 2018 and gave a talk at the LMB, and he said, and I quoted that, "I've only done courses in chemistry for nurses." So maybe he didn't quite understand what Rosalind was talking about. Anyway, they had a go at building a model. So they produced a 3-chain model, which was completely opposite to what Rosalind had said. So, which was very similar, in fact, to a model that Linus Pauling produced as well, where the bases are sticking out from the chain. And this would not be possible because we would need the water to stabilize the structure. So Rosalind and Wilkins came up to Cambridge, and Rosalind asked, "Where is the water?" and was told there isn't any. So that structure was an impossible structure. And Wilkins later wrote, or reminiscent, "These highly intelligent Cambridge chaps turning up with something which obviously was crazily wrong. The whole thing was turned inside out." So I think people forget that there were these two completely wrong models. But of course, there was a right model as well. So because Linus Pauling had discovered the alpha helix in proteins, so Linus Pauling was really the protein chemist of the day. In Cambridge, they were trying to solve the structure on myoglobin and hemoglobin, which Francis Crick was working on as well. So the race, if there ever was a race, was actually between Pauling, Watson, and Crick, and not Rosalind, Wilkins, and Watson and Crick. So you might have heard about a report that Rosalind wrote up because this was an MRC unit. The unit up in Cambridge was an MRC unit, and this report was shared with Francis Crick and Jim Watson. And it was Max Perutz that shared this. And from that, they had the data to allow them then to actually build the correct model. They needed the information around Chargaff's rule, which said that the amount of A equals the amount of T and C and G in any living organism. So that allowed them also to think about how these base pairings, so the hydrogen bonding between the bases, formed. And that's the leap they did, was to understand the antiparallel helical chains and the base pairing. Now, the controversy was, of course, that in their acknowledgement, they say in their publication in 1953, we have been stimulated by a knowledge of the general nature of the unpublished experimental results and ideas, which was clearly an understatement. And it would actually take several decades before the structure was confirmed. And actually, they got it slightly wrong as well, because the number of hydrogen bonds were wrong in the original model. Just a little bit of curiosa is that the drawing in their paper of the DNA double helix was made by Odile Crick, so Francis' wife, because they needed someone who could quickly make a drawing for their publication to beat Linus Pauling. So J.D. Bernal was a very important person in X-ray crystallography. For example, Florence Bell, who did the first structure studies on DNA, had trained with him. Dorothy Hodgkin had trained with him. And now Rosalind was in his unit in Birkbeck after the DNA years. And in her obituary...
As a scientist, Miss Franklin was distinguished by extreme clarity and perfection in everything she undertook. Her photographs are among the most beautiful X-ray photographs of any substance ever taken.
So that was a recording, but it was not J.D. Bernal himself. So in this obituary, we can get a flavor for how hard-working Rosalind was up until the end of her life, really. And I just wanted to finish with something uplifting. I thought this was very sweet with Rosalind and her brother David at the seaside. And as Jenifer mentioned, Rosalind loved everything French. And this was when she had been buying some shoes in Paris. So I want to finish with that, and I'm happy to take any questions. So actually, before I totally finish, I want to share something else as well.
I knew Rosalind well. I knew Morris Wilkins well, and Morris had, I think, more of an antipathy to Rosalind even than Jim did. I think Rosalind had, I think, no negative or antagonistic feelings toward anybody. I mean, I think with Morris Wilkins that he was a bit amateurish about a lot of things that he did, and you know, I mean, Rosalind was she was brilliant and knowledgeable and you know, very well focused. 1955, that she had Bernal had gotten these two old houses, 21 and 22 Torrington Square, for laboratory. They were 18th century terrace houses. The ones on either side had been bombed, and there were just these two houses left. Rosalind had an office up in the attic, the top floor of, I guess it was 21 Torrington Square, and we had been chatting in her office, and then going to go off for dinner, and before we left, Rosalind took out her umbrella and opened it up and put it on top of her desk. I was a bit puzzled. I said, what's that for? And she said, the roof leaks. She said that last week that the rain had come in and soaked all her papers.
Enthusiasm and tremendous skill and insight. What she didn't have, in a way that Crick and, say, Pauling had, was a kind of imagination, and she was absolutely first class. And there's no doubt that if Watson and Crick hadn't intervened, she would have got out the double helix on her own. It would have taken longer, it would have leaked out, and so on. And so, but people who get Nobel Prizes aren't necessarily the most imaginative of people. There are people who sometimes find a system, develop a system, do very useful work. So I don't put her in the very top class, using Pauling and Crick as examples. And she also, she was quite a lively person. She once said to me that what's the use of doing all this work if we don't get some fun out of it? So she enjoyed doing what she did. She was very practical.
And so Watson book clearly shows her as one of the 4 protagonists in the whole story. So she, and that actually puts her right center stage. And so it was a very useful book, although she's painted a bit awkward there, which I don't think she was. But then Watson painted himself slightly awkward too, and so he was able to say what he liked. And that's when it was cunningly written, so he could say what he liked. She was determined to be treated equally on her own merits. She wasn't a feminist in the modern sense, but she was sometimes a bit impatient. And it's well known that she didn't get on with Maurice Wilkins at King's because they're very different characters. If she'd been a man, it would have been much the same. He was rather shrewd, slow, systematic, careful. She was rather impulsive, fairly fierce, and so on, different personalities.
I had a great admiration for her, and was very, very fond of her.
I think this is the end of this short event today. Thank you very much for coming here and sharing, and thank you all for coming here and listening. Thank you.